Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick.
Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. We've just been through a traumatic presidential election, but dangerous threats to our system of elections, and thus to democracy itself, preceded the outlandish behavior of Donald Trump, and they are still with us. We'll talk about this with my guest, Eliza Schwerin Becker, who is the counsel to the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Eliza, thanks for being with us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So Donald Trump lost the election, but one of the things he and his allies tried to do was to get Republican state legislatures in states that he lost to sort of set up their own electors and overturn the will of the people and throw the election to Trump in those swing states. My question is, what's to prevent Republicans from trying that sort of thing in the future? And in addition to that, what's to prevent them from trying to elect compliant governors and secretaries of state and other folks who might sabotage elections going forward? Is this something that you're concerned about, or is this just my paranoia going wild?
I think the behavior that we saw from the president and some of his supporters in the last month or so is deeply concerning. So I think your concerns are justified. And what we saw this year is the president just completely shattering electoral norms and stress testing our civic institutions, our courts, election officials at the local and state levels. And what I think really stood in the way of the baseless accusations of fraud and the attempts to overturn the will of the people were those elected officials in some state legislatures were county and local election administrators, state secretaries of state, and judges in the state and federal levels from both parties who really held the line and defended our democracy against a serious effort to try to subvert the way that votes are counted and cast, and to intimidate officials from carrying out their constitutional duties. So right. I think it's concerning, but what stands in the way, I guess, is people. And what we saw this year, I think more starkly than ever, is that our democratic institutions fundamentally just come down to the people who make them up.
So while we have concerns, I guess we also have a reason to sort of collectively pat the nation on the back for withstanding this threat. We did come through and the election turned out the way the voters wanted the election to turn out. Nevertheless, there was still a great deal of voter suppression, and I want to talk about voter suppression, but specifically, can you talk about some of the suppression or attempts at suppression that we saw in the presidential election?
Yes, well, some of it I think was rhetorical, and that came down to statements from the president encouraging unauthorized poll watchers to show up at the polls and suggesting that he may turn a blind eye or even encourage violence at the polls. The president also repeatedly attacked the integrity of mail voting and effectively was trying to discourage people from participating in an election in a pandemic where mail voting was for many people, the only safe way that they could cast their ballots. But in addition to this rhetoric that was just trying to discourage people from turning out, the president also initiated or joined a slew of lawsuits that was attempting to push back on state policies that expanded access to mail voting, for example, or different ways of delivering mail ballots like drop boxes, to prevent people from being able to exercise a choice in how they vote and protect themselves in doing so. And we also saw state elected officials do some of the same. For example, Governor Abbott in Texas sued to prevent the affirmative distribution of mail ballot applications. And what we saw, particularly in terms of voter suppression in the primaries, was very, very long lines to vote and polling place closures, which is a pattern that we've seen over the last particularly 7 years or so after the Supreme Court Shelby County decision.
Right. So, you know, Trump has been relentless in his contention that the election was rigged, that votes were stolen or improperly cast, et cetera, et cetera. And there's been widespread concern that this will undermine faith in the electoral process going forward. But there's also a concern that this could lead to intensified suppression efforts by the Republicans. Have we seen anything along those lines, or is it just too early to tell?
Well, it is still early. Not all legislatures have come back to start planning for the 2021 session, but some key states have started pre-filing or introducing bills, or legislators are talking about what they are going to do in response to the president's baseless claims about the rigged election. So, for example, Georgia's Secretary of State has indicated that he would support a requirement of photo ID for mail voting. There are some indications that Georgia senators would try to eliminate no excuse absentee mail voting and would try to eliminate mail ballot drop boxes, which so many people took advantage of this year. In Pennsylvania, legislators have said they want to get rid of no excuse absentee voting. They want a new voter ID law, and they want to limit who can send out mail ballot applications. And we're seeing lots of activity in Texas, particularly in response to efforts by local officials to make it easier to vote this year. We're seeing bills that would limit who can provide ballot applications. We're seeing more punishment or potential criminal penalties for election officials, which is really, startling because local election officials were heroes of this last year's election.
Right.
They worked tirelessly to pull off an election in the middle of a pandemic and to impose criminal and civil penalties on them for often mistakes is just startling given the environment that they just went through.
It was interesting, the election officials that you're talking about were from both parties. I mean, there were Republicans and Democrats who stood tall in the face of sort of the things that you've just been describing, but also serious threats of violence, including in some cases death threats. I mean, it was really got frightening at times. So there's been this widespread voter suppression, but also much of the voter suppression is very clearly targeted. And I just want to read something that one of your colleagues at the Brennan Center, Wendy Weiser, wrote in an article for the American Prospect magazine. This is a quote: "Race has been a significant factor. In 2008, voter participation among African Americans and certain other groups surged. Then came backlash. The more a state saw increases in minority and low-income voter turnout, the more likely it was to push laws cutting back on voting rights." That's the end of the quote. So can you talk a little bit about some of the different ways that the voter suppression has been racially targeted?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind are the places that the president and others have targeted in trying to overturn the will of the people. This is Milwaukee, Detroit, and Philadelphia, places with big populations of Black and Brown voters. And I think what effectively you're seeing from the president is a narrative that Black votes, for example, are inherently fraudulent. That is the oldest narrative in the voter suppression storybook, unfortunately. But other methods of voter suppression, like voter ID requirements or diminished resources for polling places that result in long lines, those things have a greater effect on voters of color who are disproportionately underserved by the state and local offices that are maybe fewer in their communities, who may be less likely to be able to wait in line for 3 hours and take that time off of work because of the intersection between socioeconomic circumstances and race in this country. But we also see very clear and almost deliberate instances of voter suppression on the basis of race in felony disenfranchisement laws that are still on the books across the country and that have their roots in Jim Crow era efforts to disenfranchise Black men in particular who were recently reenfranchised after the Civil War and Reconstruction.
Something that's not specifically voter suppression, but has the same effect, it diminishes the effect of individual votes, is gerrymandering, which both parties have been guilty historically of gerrymandering. There's actually been historically a bit of fondness for it. But now it's been pushed to extremes, and it's been pushed primarily by the Republican Party. Can you talk a little bit about, well, first, what gerrymandering is, what's been happening, and why this is so insidious?
So gerrymandering is the practice of drawing districts to favor one political party or to decrease the voting power of certain groups of voters, for example, Black voters. And there are typically considered two types of gerrymandering: partisan gerrymandering, which with increasingly sophisticated digital tools has led to maps or the drawing of districts that lock in a comfortable majority of seats for one side, even when the voters are more or less evenly split between the two parties. And the result is outcomes that don't reflect what voters actually want in uncompetitive races that encourage politicians to cater to extremes and too often underrepresentation of communities of color.
Right.
Racial gerrymandering, by contrast, is the drawing of districts that specifically dilutes the voting power of a protected minority. And federal courts have said that racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court ruled last year that political gerrymandering is not an issue that federal courts can address, that the Constitution has anything to say about.
Right. And that being the case, given that Supreme Court ruling, how do well, groups like your own, like the Brennan Center, but people who want to uphold the integrity of elections, how do they then fight back against that kind of gerrymandering?
Well, there are a couple of ways to do it. The first thing is to recognize that states typically draw their own districts for state elections and for congressional districts. And so states have begun adopting independent redistricting commissions that are going to draw the lines, or that are already drawing the lines in their states in a hopefully nonpartisan way. And in the Supreme Court decision that said political gerrymandering is non-justiciable, the court also effectively smiled upon those independent redistricting commissions, saying the solution, the remedy you're looking for, can be found at least in part in some of those state-based solutions. The court also pointed to Congress and said that Congress has the authority to draw districts or remedy this issue, which it determined was political. And so one opportunity is through redistricting done at the federal level, or standards for what kind of redistricting is permissible, rather, at the federal level.
Right. Now, you've mentioned the Supreme Court ruling back in 2013, and that was the one in which the court, led by Chief Justice John Roberts, basically gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is one of the most important civil rights act, if not the most important, that was ever passed. What was the rationale for that ruling? And it's been a few years now, so can you talk a little bit about what effect it has had?
Sure. So one of the most potent tools of the Voting Rights Act, which you're right, is one of the most successful pieces of federal legislation in the history of our country, was something called a pre-clearance regime, which required that jurisdictions with a demonstrated record of racial discrimination in voting had to get their changes to voting policies pre-cleared or approved by either the Department of Justice or a federal court in Washington, D.C. And in 2013, writing for the court, Justice Roberts found that the coverage formula, the part of this Voting Rights Act that determined which jurisdictions were subject to pre-clearance, was too out of date, and struck that formula down, determining that the conditions that originally justified the measures, basically the racial discrimination in voting, were no longer present in the covered jurisdictions. And really, in a stinging dissent by the late Justice Ginsburg, she wrote that throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory challenges is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. So basically the rationale was pre-clearance was working too well.
It was such a great image from Justice Ginsburg, but it's really startling that the decision was, maybe it was expected, but it was I still found it upsetting. I'm old enough to remember when the Voting Rights Act was passed. I'm old enough to remember all the effort that went into getting that law passed, including the lives lost, et cetera. But what have we seen since that ruling by the court?
Well, the absence of pre-clearance, the effects were immediate and they were really stark. So immediately on the day Shelby County was decided, Texas announced that it was going to implement its strict voter ID requirement, which had previously been blocked by pre-clearance. We also saw Mississippi and Alabama begin to enforce photo ID laws that had been barred. We saw a few months later, North Carolina enact a sweeping election reform bill with a voter ID law that the Fourth Circuit struck down in 2016 because it targeted, quote, African Americans with almost surgical precision. So we saw, voter suppressive laws specifically impacting Black voters and other minority voters, a slew of them following that 2013 decision, in addition to a lot voterless purge surges, the closure of polling places, just last year in 2019, Florida passed a law that limited the felony reenfranchisement provision that Florida voters had passed through Amendment 4. So the effects of the absence of the pre-clearance formula and regime were felt immediately and continue to be felt to this day, which is why it's so important that Congress is considering what is now called the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore the pre-clearance regime to the Voting Rights Act.
So now this story is not all doom and gloom. Just as you mentioned, the state officials and the courts that stood tall in the face of ludicrous challenges and wild threats. There are also people all over the country, people and organizations that are fighting back against all these threats to voting rights in the country. It's kind of amazing that in 2020, there are so many of these threats. So can you give us an overview of the kinds of things that are being done to protect the right to vote in this country and to make voting easier in some cases?
So as you note, the election was actually a remarkable success given that it was conducted in a pandemic and with so many attacks on the right to vote. And that credit really goes to the hundreds, if not thousands, of voting rights advocates who fought tooth and nail all year long to make sure that we could hold a safe and secure election during the pandemic. That took the form of lawsuits to try to at least temporarily suspend rules that made it harder for people to vote by mail or expand access to voting by mail. It took the form of advocacy with state and local election officials to make sure they were prepared to handle mail ballots in a pandemic, voting in a pandemic, making sure they actually kept their polling places open, or if they didn't, they had a plan for notifying voters what the changes were, and educating voters about how to participate in an election during the pandemic. I mean, one of the things we saw in Pennsylvania, for example, was a massive campaign to make sure that voters included the inner secrecy envelope in the bigger envelope that they sent back their mail ballot to avoid what they call in Pennsylvania naked ballots. And that was an extraordinarily successful effort. We saw many, many fewer ballot rejections in Pennsylvania in the general election than we did in the primary. So both everyday citizens and voting rights lawyers and advocates worked tremendously hard to make that possible. And there are additional policies that we and others are pressing state legislatures and Congress to adopt in the coming year that will make it easier for voters to register, make it easier for voters to cast their ballots, expand who can vote by restoring the right to vote to people with past felony convictions. So there are lots of opportunities as well, and we can try to make sure that the promise of the right to vote is really available to every American.
I'm not sure how one would answer this question, but this very real concern about large numbers of Americans losing faith in the integrity of our elections. How do you fight back against that? And then on the very specific issues of voter suppression, what more would you like to see done?
So I think the disinformation that the president has seeded over the past several months is really dangerous. And we do have to fight back against the lies that he has planted and that some of his supporters genuinely believe. I think one of the ways to fight back against that is, as you indicated, the courts standing up and saying actually what is true, that there has been no evidence of fraud, that there's no reason to doubt the integrity of this election. And what's key there is the interlocutor, the speaker. These are judges that are appointed by Republicans and Democrats.
Right.
And we've also seen Republican election officials stand up to the president, particularly in Georgia, but also local election officials and state legislators. So those people who have committed themselves to defend, constitutional democracy have to keep speaking up and speaking particularly to, Trump voters who have believed this misinformation. But in terms of what more there is to do, there is an opportunity, particularly in Congress, to pass what was known as HR 1 or the For the People Act, which was introduced and passed in the House in 2019. And that would do things like enact automatic voter registration. So that it's not on the voter to make sure that they're registered or their voter registration address is updated. It would enact online voter registration, same-day voter registration, nationwide early voting, expand no excuse mail voting, restore voting rights to people with past felony convictions, at least for federal elections. And many of these reforms share a common theme, which is that they shift the burden, the cost of registering and voting away from the voter, where it is mostly located right now, and onto the state and other administrative entities. It shouldn't be the burden of every American citizen to figure out where to vote, figure out how to get registered, figure out to make sure that they haven't been purged. The state needs to take back some of that responsibility, and some of these provisions in HR 1 would help do that. Also, as I mentioned, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to restore the pre-clearance regime is on the table in the next Congress. And all of us should be encouraging our senators, our members of Congress, to push and support that and restore protections against voting discrimination.
Now, these are a lot of reforms that are necessary, and it's a wide range of reforms. I'm going to put you on the spot here in the last minute or so that we have. If you could wave a magic wand and set up the perfect voting system in this country, and I know it's difficult because we have federal elections and then we have state and local elections, but if you could wave that wand, what would the system look like?
So as you note, our election system is a bit odd because every state has their own administration for how they run elections. And in some cases that's good because they get to tailor their policies to what their specific, but I think that two of the key reforms that if I could wave a magic wand, I would implement would be automatic voter registration and same-day registration, because we are leaving so many voters on the table by making it so difficult for people to get registered and stay registered to vote. And millions of Americans aren't even participating in the process at all. And anything that we can do to encourage that civic participation, to make it easier, to lower the barrier to entry, because once people become voters, they tend to stay voters.
Right.
But we need to get people into the process and welcome them into the process.
How would automatic voter registration work?
So the way it works in the 17 states and DC that have adopted it are you go to the DMV, and instead of asking you, do you want to register to vote? If you do, fill out this, check this box or fill out this form. It says, we are going to register you to vote unless you opt out. So It basically capitalizes on all of our inertia when we are, undergoing any kind of process. And anyone is welcome to opt out, but the default is that people will get registered to vote, or their registration will get updated when they're at the DMV or when they're at another state agency that's providing services. And we've done analysis on the states that have implemented automatic voter registration. And in every state that has done it, there have been, statistically significant increases in the number of people who are registered to vote. So it really does work, and it does bring people into the process. The other piece of automatic voter registration is the electronic transfer of information from the DMV or the state agency to the state election official. So it eliminates the paper records process, which reduces the likelihood of a typo or an error or a lost piece of paper, and actually can lower the cost of voting and election administration for states.
We're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. This was terrific, and I love the fact that there is at least some reason for optimism. Thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it. And to our viewers, that's all for now, but we'll see you next time.